Hello everybody, this is For the Masters podcast. Today we're going to be discussing a big topic, namely Biden's foreign policy. Biden is coming in a really crucial time, I think, for America and its foreign policy, and is probably one of the best qualified individuals to take on the mantle at such a crucial time. He's been a foreign policy expert, someone who specialises in foreign policy for a very long time, and is an individual of the mind that the most important thing that a president does is in relation to his foreign policy, and has said so at various points over his very long career. As vice president, he was one of the most influential individuals within Obama's staff, and was responsible for several important negotiations in the Obama-Biden administration. I think Obama is a good place to start when it comes to Joe Biden, as is often the case. Obama, in many ways, in a quite a simplistic explanation, but I think one that allows everyone to get to grips with what Biden means, is a forerunner and someone who pressed the post-1990s consensus on what the US's role was. The US in this vision is a global policeman, one that supports human rights, democracy, is keen on mediation, and is keen on collaboration, but also being an active collaborative partner, one that is pushing for positive geopolitical change. So, for example, we might look towards Obama's role in the Paris Climate Agreement, or the Iran nuclear deal, or even the Arab Spring and the overthrow of individuals like Gaddafi as examples of this. Importantly, I think most importantly, he promoted free trade and globalization, and this was often dressed up in the language of being good for the United States. However, it often did not correlate into such, and I think there's one of the big stories of the past 10 or so years is the fact that free trade failed to really mean increases across the population of real wages to a great extent. In fact, often jobs that people have been doing for a very long time and communities that were based upon these jobs were actually exported to places like China, and as a result there was really deep dissatisfaction at American foreign policy. So that's one side of the coin, and Trump, in many respects, represented a reaction to it. Trump, in a very simplistic way, thought that neoliberalism was flawed, or at least the form that people like Obama propagated. He sought to counter job losses by making US foreign policy America first, to use the now famous expression. He thought that he could counter this by achieving transactional victories against important partners such as China and others, for example the European Union, of course, as well, that he felt that were gaining an advantage, an unfair advantage against the US. I think this is a strategically flawed, albeit tactically successful, attempt by Trump to gain incremental advantages against other nations, and I think that it recognises that there is a problem at the heart of US foreign policy, but I think that it is attempting to fix that in a way which is really quite destructive to the US's image and brand at a global level. US power is often fundamentally based on the fact that it has this vision, the city on the hill, as it's often referred to it. It's an example, and the US often leads by an example. As a result, when Trump, for example, prioritised transactional victories over erstwhile allies and close partners, as well as notional enemies such as China, he often failed to wield influence in a way which would maximise the success of his policy, and often shedded huge amounts of geopolitical influence, some of it permanently, in a very significant way. And I think that a lot can be said that's bad about Trump, but I think that even though he did make these really quite poor strategic decisions, it is also the case that he did recognise something that people have been trying to tell politicians for a very long time. The system does not work for us. And I think that's something that Biden picks up on with his foreign policy as well as his domestic policy, and attempts to integrate it into his own. And this is I think, Biden's foreign policy. Biden is attempting to unite these two seemingly disparate policies. The attempt to create this city on the hill, where the power of example and the power of having this geopolitically influential moral agent that acts morally rather than its own self-interest, while at the same time ensuring that, although it is acting in a moral way to better the interests of everyone across the globe, it is at the same time benefiting itself. So what Biden is attempting to do is to attempt to bridge that gap between those two policies, in my view. Seeing, for example, as one of the biggest examples, I think, China is a threat, while at the same time seeking to make sure that there is a successful coalition that's able to bring long-standing, tangible benefit to both the US and the world when it comes to thinking about the sort of threat that China poses, and recognising that it's not just threatening the US, but it's threatening many individual countries. Now we're on to part two, in which I'll be focusing on where the US's and the Biden administration's geopolitical priorities. I think the first thing to note here is there is a pivot, and I'm using the word pivot because it's not a complete abandonment, away from Europe and the Middle East towards China and Asia. Why? Well, I mean, it's very complicated, but I think there's a few reasons why this makes sense. The first is there's little strategic gains to be made in the Middle East. I think over the past 20 years it's been shown that often very intensive engagement with the Middle East, often in a way which misunderstands its historical, political and geopolitical nuances, often is counterproductive for the USA. And also, there is decreasing amounts of gains that can be made from an active US policy in the Middle East. Oil is not as useful as it was 20 years ago, for a variety of reasons. One, the US is producing increasing amounts of oil as a result of shale. It's the number one oil exporter in the world, and also the threat of nuclear powers in the Middle East is increasingly something that the US is not willing to tolerate, but also is something that's increasingly likely within the Middle East, something that the US wants to focus on rather than gaining raw influence in order to gain oil. I think that the US recognises that a light touch and acting as a mediator in the Middle East is likely to gain it more power than attempting to try and create proxy wars on its own behalf, and attempting to make powers like the Iranians do things that they just don't want to do, and will actively resist, often with the support of their anti-American populations, turned away from the USA by years of false promises about what democracy, for example, is likely to produce in their countries. Similarly, I think that Europe is increasingly turning and pivoting away from the US, and the US is although not completely withdrawing from Europe, like in the Middle East, is accepting that it is within its self-interest probably to allow Europe to be more self-sufficient. There's an increasingly vocal pro-European lobby within individual European countries, and the European Commission and the European Union as a whole is increasingly gaining in power and strength, and increasingly it is attempting to take on many of the foreign policy powers of individual European countries, for example, in relation to defence, but also in relation to exports and trade. I think also the fact that the UK has left the European Union has meant that the US is going to be less influential within the European Union. The UK traditionally has been this pivot around which the EU-US relationship has been able to become very closely entwined. The UK has very close connections with both the US, with which it has a so-called special relationship, and there are deep cultural and political ties. And the UK has traditionally been a member of the European Union. As a result, it's been able to garner support and influence in both. When the UK left the European Union, the US was unable to do this to the same extent, although there is still this quite close collaboration between three largely ideologically and culturally similar political units. I think more than anything else, though, I think that there is no longer really an existential threat to Europe in the same way that there once was, i.e. in the time of the Cold War, and the US sees very little substantive gains or objectives in Europe, especially as a result of relatively anemic, when I say it's relatively anemic, it's in relation to fast-growing economies in Asia, growth in the European Union. So I think although the European Union and the US will continue to cooperate on shared interests, it will certainly be less a case of US domination and more a case of mutually beneficial relationship where there is mutual consent and mutual interest in shared interests, such as promoting human rights across the globe, countering Russia and countering China. Similarly, Russia is also something which I think that the US is going to be slightly moving away from and viewing in a slightly different light. Instead of being a threat in the way in which it was in the Cold War and in potentially the early 2000s, it's seen more of as a nuisance. For example, things like election interference as well as the imprisonment of Navalny, both things which the US is keen to condemn Russia on. It's certainly the case that the US is viewing Russia not as something that is going to threaten its key interests in a way which will permanently threaten its power on a global scale. Rather, it is attempting to bear pressure in order for Russia to relent on thinking that it can get away with anything that it wants to. And I think that this is a really different relationship to the sort of one that we saw in obviously the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union, or the one that I think that Russia wants to see itself as a geopolitical enemy and great power at a similar sort of level as the US. And until I think the rise of China in the past few years was seen almost as a potential threat in that sort of light, because it did look to be militarily and economically something that could potentially stand up to the USA if any power could. Okay. That being said, I think that we also need to have a quick look at why Asia is such an important area to pivot towards. I think there's two reasons here. Both rely on the fact that there is very rapid indeed economic growth, meaning that the influence and power of many of the nations within Asia is increasing at a greatly increasing level. For example, I think that the first thing is that there is an increasingly influential potential threat in China. Obviously, with human rights abuse of the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, as well as other minorities, as well as unfair competitive practices in terms of their economy, things like state-owned enterprises, and having many informal barriers to foreign entry into their markets, as well as aggressive geopolitics in Asia and Africa, in things like making other countries highly indebted and as a result ceding to them important military and political assets. These are things which the US wants to combat China on. The second thing, and I think this is often overlooked, is that there is an increasingly influential set of potential allies in Asia, namely, for example, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and of course Burma as well. These all have high rates of economic growth, and as a result are potential counters towards China. And I think that this I think is often overlooked, but in terms of combating China, the US really can't act alone, and often a lot of these nations have both parties within them or factions within them that favour either closer ties with the US or China, and it's really the case that targeted, effective political action at this very moment could swing it one way or another. So, for example, Pakistan is highly indebted to the Chinese in some respects, but at the same time has somewhat close relations with the US historically. The final thing is that often this very fast economic growth also has an impact in relation to climate change and several other of the US's objectives in terms of, for example, creating a high growth economy in the US. If the US is going to both grow very quickly and reduce the effects of climate change, as well as continue the set precedents for the future in terms of things like keeping the South China Sea open for an increasing proportion of global trade, then the US needs to really pivot towards this essential region. Okay, part 3 is, will this work? It's a good question to ask because a lot has changed in the past few years, and there are a growing set of problems in a rapidly changing world, which mean that the US is not necessarily likely to be able to influence change that in the same way that it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first problem, I think, is a domestic, I would call it an increasing interlinking of domestic and foreign policy. One very important ramification of this is that it's increasingly political, and often at a federal level, foreign policy seems increasingly transient. It's a good example of this is the Paris Climate Agreement. The Republicans and the Democrats were very quick or rather, Joe Biden and Donald Trump were very quick to overturn their predecessors' view on the Paris Climate Agreement, because both was done by executive order or executive agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement was obviously signed by Barack Obama and overturned by Donald Trump, and very soon after that overturned by Joe Biden. It seems increasingly the case that several aspects of foreign policy are subject, much like several aspects of domestic policy, are subject to the whims of the incoming president and a really partisan approach. Obviously this has big impacts about the sustainability of an approach to foreign policy. Can Joe Biden make his make his attempted foreign policy solution long-lasting in a way which his predecessor Donald Trump wasn't. I think there's some cause for optimism here, although of course we can't guarantee that everything that that Joe Biden does will continue into the near future. Republicans and Democrats, I think, do agree on more than is superficially the case. On strategically vital elements of foreign policy like China, there is rare bipartisan support on cracking down. What's more, I think that a lot of the issues when it came to Trump and his desire to overturn much of Barack Obama's legacy comes from his peculiarity as a person rather than some structural problem with US politics. Trump had a very odd approach to foreign policy that emphasised personal relationships and transactional victories over, for example, long-term, structural and sensible political plays. To give an example, he was very keen to overturn the Iran nuclear agreement very rapidly, and several of his breaks with previous presidents came in the form of things like his meeting with Kim Jong-un, something which I doubt that any other Republican would have done. So I think it is a real problem, but I do think that people do overemphasise the extent to which this is going to be the death knell of any permanent US foreign policy outlook. The second problem, I think, again, is to do with Donald Trump. He did a lot of damage to the brand of the USA, and it wasn't all him. There was damage done to the brand of the USA by George Bush Jr. as well, in terms of the war on terror, something that was incredibly unpopular in the Middle East and really dented the US's reputation there, as well as to some extent Barack Obama and other generally liberal politicians or Democrats who prioritise this quite unsatisfactory, often seemingly shallow vision of a neoliberal politics which seemed to emphasise the individual over the community, something which didn't gain wide-ranging support everywhere. I think that the answer in this, again, it's a difficult one, and I don't think there's necessarily any solution to the damaged brand that successive US presidents have done, especially Donald Trump, who caused utter carnage to the US's reputation. But I think that there needs to be a relatively mature recognition that although the US professes to this moral vision of how society and geopolitics should be, that it doesn't hold all the answers, and that it shouldn't attempt to force its political vision onto the world. Instead, it needs to be reflective, respectful, conciliatory, but I think most importantly quite authentic in its approach, in the sense that it's not really like pretending to hold all the answers. It's not really pretending to hold all the answers and forcing its will on other countries unnecessarily in, for example, the way that it did in relation to promoting democracy in the Arab Spring. I think that's really unappealing when the US tries to promote its vision of liberal democracy on countries which just don't want it or are not ready for it. So I think that one can be overcome, but I think it would take a lot of work and for a lot of resistance from the president towards people wanting the US to take an approach which, instead of prioritising image, prioritises either promoting democracy or promoting promoting, I think, an American first vision. The third thing, I think, is whether America can keep hold of the West / democracies in general. I said that the US is withdrawing from Europe, and to an extent I think that this poses some sort of problem if it's going to continue to build the necessary coalitions in order to get what it wants. If the US is going to wield power globally, I think that it is necessary in order to build these coalitions on issue-by-issue bases. For example, look at the way in which the Iran nuclear agreement was created. It was created as a result of a rubber stamping by several other powers as well as the US, as well as for example, if we look at something like China in the future, that's going to need a coalition of powers which have been wronged by it in order to bring it in order to make it accountable. I think that this is actually possible, and I think that this is not the existential threat that many make it out to be. The EU is still likely to, for example, the EU is still likely to follow the US's lead on things that it does also agree with, things like China. But I think that it is likely to be cautious on many of these things, and often is likely to be the leader in the place where the US was once the leader on things, for example, like big tech regulation, where it's already taken a global role. So I think that problem is not as big as people make it out to be. The final thing, and I promise this is the final thing, is influence in Asia. Will the US be able to beat China? I think it's important to think about what sort of influence the US has in the world after the US has had Donald Trump, who has broken the image of the US being this city on a hill which all nations can look up to. Staunch US allies are no longer as staunch, and it's important to recognise that they may never be as closely entwined to the US as they were once. But despite this, I think that it is important to have a look at Asia on a case-by-case basis and realise that there really still is the coalition there to take on China, something that is the most pressing US and priority, and something that's shared by many others. So if we look at, for example, there are a whole load of countries that can be broadly described as sinophobe rather. For example, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. Many of these countries are really find China to be a substantial threat, and as well as other powers such as India, which is sort of an independent power that acts antagonistically towards China. It seems like the US can really muster a really significant proportion of the globe in order to counter China. More economically influential consumer countries are stronger, are in the US camp than I think the China camp. So China has something like 15% of global GDP relative to the EU, which has 20%, the US, which has 25%, as well as 10% in like India, South Korea, and Australia combined, or Japan combined rather. This adds up to like a really significant coalition, and I think that it's going to be very, very, very hard indeed for China to not back down in the face of the pressure from all of these democratic anti-China powers. As a result, I think that the idea that the moment has passed and that the China cannot be held to account at all is really, really overstated. It's certainly the case that the US can defeat China. All it needs is a competent administration that brings together a group of like-minded countries. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.